clients, a number of clients across many different industries with exactly what we'll be going through here today. So now that we have gotten through that, just a quick overview of the different items that we will be talking about today. So first, just an overview. I just want to quickly review the data layer, just some of those high points about what that object is going to contain, and then also the process for how it's working, because we really need to understand that in order to be able to understand how and why and what to be testing. We'll then walk through what documentation. A huge part of testing and being able to identify any sorts of issues is having the documentation necessary and knowing what should things be looking like to then be able to test against it. I'll go through what some of that documentation can look like, as well as just some examples of testing documentation that we've put together and used in the past to really help in that entire process, keep track of everything, keep everything organized. We'll then go into how to actually access the data layer. This is going to be a little bit more manual checking and how to go about doing that, what to look for, how to actually see what is contained within an object, values, variables, structure, all that. I think getting a manual look at everything and understanding how to do that, yourself, one, is helpful for spot checking. Two, is helpful for understanding, again, a deeper dive into what exactly we're talking about. We'll then go into some important considerations to think about as you're testing the data layer and validating everything, and then a few topics around automated testing and then validation at a massive scale. So how we can go about that, across, say you're managing 20, 30, or even 1,000 or 2,000 websites. I'll go through a couple techniques for how you can help automate this process, both using some tools that you're probably already using, such as analytics, as well as tools such as Tag Inspector. At the end, we'll just quickly run through everything in a summary and answer any questions. As always, please don't hesitate, and please do drop questions as we're going through different items into the question pane if anything is unclear or we want to dig into anything a little bit deeper. Ask a question about it, drop a comment. Happy to address it as we go through these different items. And if I can't, or if it's better answered at the end, we'll circle back to it. Anything that I can't get to here on this webinar, follow up via email. So fire away. Happy to help out. So to get started here, in terms of the overview, so just a quick review of the data layer, what it is, how it functions. I love this visual. Again, I always give a shout out to, I believe it's Telium that put together this visual here, but we use it on most of our data layer webinars. But it does a great job of showing how that data layer, which is that blue level that sits in between the front end of the website and the back end, so all the different tools that you're using and everything that's powering the website, how it sits in between there, plugging into both, and then acts as a layer of organized data in between. So that is what we're talking about. That is what we're wanting to validate and test. Now, once you define that data layer architecture and you define everything that should be in there and you start referencing it for all of the different tags and tracking and analytics, campaign tracking, attribution, all that good stuff that you're doing on your website, it becomes critical. If something's missing from the data layer or some structure is off, that data point is not going to be available within reporting in any of those platforms that is referencing it. So it's a positive and a negative in many ways. The negative is, one, if one thing goes wrong in that data layer, things go wrong across multiple platforms. But the positives there are you're able to catch any issues a lot faster, and then it's also much easier to fix, test, and maintain. So in terms of what's typically included in your data layer structure, we'll get into it a little bit more, but any information that is relevant for the page or the content that the user is looking at, as well as any user type of information that you need for reporting and for analytics, attribution, all those different things, and different types of marketing, advertising technologies that you're using on your site. So things like your page title, page name, category, any product information for products being viewed, or any basket information on a checkout page or purchase type of information, as well as any context that you might be pulling from your content management system on the back end or on content pages or on a content website. And then when I say user information, things like a guest ID, user ID, maybe a hashed email, if you're trying to working with some different types of remarketing platforms. All of those things should be contained within that data layer object, which makes it centrally available for all the different tags, pixels, tracking technologies that you're using on your website. In terms of this typical structure, this is going to be dictated oftentimes by the platforms that you're using. A lot of different analytics platforms, for example, have native functionality built into them, where if your data layer is in a particular structure and using certain nomenclature, it's automatically supported by and available to just automatically be collected, the values associated with those items by the analytics platform that you're working with. So just a quick look here at an example. This would be an example of a data layer object on a product page. You see there all of the different product information for the particular product being viewed, some information around the page name, page type, some review type information, as well as some events. So scroll events, all of those different things, any events, anything that you're wanting to track, any interaction, you're going to want to be pushing both the event, that what happened, as well as context that fills in some blanks around what happened there into that data layer object that is going to be sitting on the page to, again, make it available and easily referenceable by the different tags. So now that we understand what that just the data layer is, how it's working, what it's doing, then important to get into the testing process. So we have everything mapped out. We have the whole thing architected. We know what should be there. We've turned over those implementation guides. Our development team has worked to implement. Now it's time to test. What do we need as part of this testing process? What are the stages? Number one is documentation. All of those different things that you're defining and working through as you're defining, like your tag policy, which we've discussed on past webinars and I'm sure will again. But once you defined, okay, what tools, what platforms am I using on my site? What data points are necessary for each? What is the overlap? What are all the different data points? And what do I need for all the different tracking and different reporting that I'm needing to do? Once we map that out and then define where it sits, where it lives within the data layer, does it need to factor in and fit into a certain structure? If so, how does that look? What does timing, all that, those different things look like? All that needs to be defined within that documentation. I need to know what it is that should be happening. What are those requirements to then be able to make sure that yes, it is. Number two thing to really look at as far as this process is the structure and timing, which we'll get into how to see that. But it is critical, and it's a major issue with a lot of different clients and a lot of just people I see in general. Data must be available for it to be collected. And timing does matter with the one when tags are executing, firing rules, and then when data becomes available and is available within the data layer. So one, testing for the different structure, defining the structure, but also having a good understanding for timing. So when are tags going to be executing on this page? And when does data become available for them to actually use? We're then going to look at the variables and values specifically, primarily around nomenclature. So when we're referencing a variable or a particular item within the data layer, that needs to be consistent, because how we're setting those sorts of things up with macros or with variables within your tag management system, it's referencing something. If that nomenclature and how those variables and values are set up and the format of those does not match how everything is configured within your tag management system, the data points are not going to be collected. It's just going to be undefined. It's going to be null. And in some cases, it might throw some errors within the tags that you're wanting to run. They won't execute at all and you won't have tracking. So we need to make sure that when we define what the variables values should look like, what structure they should be in, that is being followed with how the data layer is being implemented on the website. The final piece here in the testing is just the ongoing process, right? Everything, yeah, it's going to look real good when we're first done with an implementation or with a migration or with a further build out of a data layer, but it needs to sustain and it needs to stay consistent moving forward. And a huge part of that is just constant monitoring and constant status checks and health. And I'll show you some simpler ways to go about doing that. So getting actually into the process and what each of these different stages looks like. Number one is around documentation. A big thing that I'm stressing, and it can't be said enough, that measurement plan and the documentation and the architecture that you have going into the implementation is critical. First piece of that is your measurement plan, which you should be putting together as part of defining, an overall tag and data policy. We need to know for all the different technologies that are being run on the site, and even things in the future, start thinking about, hey, this might be relevant. We need to define those things, and we need to understand what needs to be collected and what needs to be available for tracking, for reporting. So what does user information look like? Do we have a user ID? Is there any concept of logged in, logged out, or any concept of membership on the website? If so, probably good data points to include on every single page if they're available. Number two, page information. Yes, any sort of analytics platform and even your conversion tracking is going to be able to reference like your document.location that's on every single page, on every single website, just naturally. So it can pull in things like the URL. So it will have a sense of what page different actions are happening on through that. But does it make sense also to have additional context for the page? Is it maybe a page type, a page category, different sections of the website, or on a content type of website, author, topic? What's relevant in the content on this particular page that we might want to be capturing and might be available in the back end in our content management system that we want to surface and make available within that data layer. A big thing to think about as you are putting together the plan for page information and how that factors in is what types of conditional firing rules are you needing to build out for the different tags and technologies on your website? Some things, yes, it's URL based, or it might be supposed to execute across every single page. But many different technologies, say you're working with a remarketing platform like a Criteo or Criteo, which is pretty popular, you're going to need to be able to conditionally fire tags on a product page versus a category page versus a checkout funnel versus a home page. And that's true of many different types of advertising platforms. Page type or a page category is something that is going to make executing on those requirements so much easier if it is an attribute that is surfaced within the data layer. So page information, definitely consider those different items. Product and content information, so product name, product type, price, all those different sorts of things. Events, what interactions are you wanting to track? And then what type of context needs to be attached to those different events? Is it a particular type of button click, a particular form name, form title, author, if it is a download? And then what are, that last piece, what are the data points necessary for each of those different events and interactions? Looks like we have a question here. A good question just around is if it's good practice to use a try catch to suppress errors instead of going to developers each time. It really depends on the situation and the type of error that's being kicked. I mean, if it's just an error that's notifying you of some sort of an issue, it's just writing what the error is to the console, for example, especially when you're in the development stage. That's super, super helpful. At other times, there might be errors being kicked that are completely stopping the object from loading or data to be populating and blocking a lot of different tags and functionality from happening. So in cases like that, quick sort of fix in order to get things back up and running while you're trying to diagnose the true root of those different issues, it might make sense. So it's a little bit dependent upon the situation, but I definitely wouldn't recommend always going that route. Here, I just wanted to break out a couple of getting back to the structure, the requirements, and all of that type of information. Getting into what this can look like in your measurement plan, and how if you document it out in a pretty granular fashion like this, and it'll make sense in a minute how it can roll directly into how it is that we are handling and putting together our types of testing documentation. So first here, this is just a list of required data points. So as I consolidate and start thinking about all the different tracking technologies that are being used on my website, and I define, okay, these are the different data requirements for each. These are the things that I need. And then we can start breaking it out and start, what is it, a description of it, and then also what does the data layer, what is that value or that variable going to look like within the data layer? Going through this exercise, you're able to really conceptualize and think about, what do I need? And then also have it, again, very well defined and listed out. Second thing that's key is listing out the different types of events and the different contextual pieces of information that are necessary to be collected with each. Now, events they can be difficult in the sense that, especially in the planning process, you're going to have some people on the team that want to track everything, which I never recommend. Tracking everything only means that, yes, you have a data point on it, but if you have just a ton of data points and it's not being used for anything, you're just going to be drowning. It makes even your reporting suite and your reporting platform just overwhelming. And it really discourages many users from using that particular type of platform. So think about when you're thinking about interactions to track and events to track, what really drives the business? What are the goals of the website? What are the different things that that are contributing to those goals? What are my macro conversions? What are my micro conversions? What leads to those things? And then document out those different items. And then as you're thinking about, and in many cases for many different platforms, these events are defined for you. If you aren't thinking about this in the context of analytics. But some of those key different types of things might be for purchase behavior. So add to cart, gift card, remove from cart, updating bags, purchase transaction. But writing out, okay, what is the event nomenclature? What should that look like within the data layer, which you see there on the far right? And then also, when it comes to that label, defining, what are the data points, what context should be passed and should be available to me when those different sorts of events are firing. So that, again, if we want to collect a data point, it needs to be available to us at the time in which the tag is executing. So thinking through everything that's going to be necessary allows us to think about timing and when things need to be made available. The final thing that we should have is when it comes to documentation on the up front is that full implementation guide. I mean, I'm sure there is some sort of architecture documentation going into the stage between defining the requirements for the business users and then defining the requirements for the technology and development teams. So the things that are included in this implementation guide is just the data layer structure, what exactly that looks like. Now this right here, I took a screenshot out of one of our implementation guides for Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager. So you can see that data layer, just named data layer, and then some of the standard page user type information, and then the structure there as it's defined and necessary for the enhanced e-commerce native functionality within the Google Analytics platform. But what this allows us to do, if we have this implementation guide, is one, we know on each different page, each different event, exactly what the structure of the data layer should look like. We know what those variables should be. We know the nomenclature. We know what they should be named. And then we also know what those values should be. You know, are they static? Are they dynamic? If they're dynamic, things like revenue right there. One thing is always understand, you know, what does revenue mean for your business? Does it include tax? Does it include shipping? Does it exclude both? What does that mean? So that as we're going through and testing and validating, making sure that value is exactly, you know, not just that, yes, that value is there, but it is what we're expecting it to be, and including what we're expecting it to include. So we have that documentation on the front end. We have our implementation guides. We know what's required. We know what should be there. Now it is actually going through and putting together some testing documentation so that we can compare what's there now to what should be. And then we can make any sorts of corrections or updates as needed. So what are the things that are going to be required in those testing docs? We're pretty much just trying to simplify and consolidate all of those implementation docs from previously, and even really using those to inform. So we need naming conventions, we need value specifications. Example, going back to what I mentioned on the previous slide, you know, what is revenue? We need that list of events with the contextual data and where and on what interactions those events should be happening on. So we know, you know, this action occurs, I should be seeing this. And then we need those architecture specifications. And that really goes back to the structure. You know, are things, should values be strings? Is it objects and arrays? How exactly are those different pieces structured? What needs to be embedded within what? How does that whole thing look in order to be able to make sure that everything is in that proper format? Here's a quick example of just one type of simple testing documentation that I'll personally use. And this is just going through and defining, okay, on a transaction page is what this is from. And again, this is in the standard enhanced e-commerce, or from an enhanced e-commerce centered data layer implementation. What should be contained within that, the transaction information? What should that look like? And what should I have in the data layer on that confirmation page? So you can see there at the top, and this directly follows what we had just looked at within the implementation guide, as well as what was within that event guide, and then also the data requirements. So we have page information. That stuff should be there on every single page type, page category, user ID, if we have it, user type, logged in status, e-commerce. I then use the different columns in order to show, you know, if one object is nested within something else. So within e-commerce, I've got the currency code and then the purchase object. Within the purchase object, you have the action field object as well as the products object. Now, each individual product is going to be a unique array in this example, which we don't really show here broken out, but it does show that structure there. So as you go through the testing, and again, here in a minute, I'll actually walk through that manual testing process. And we're looking at the data layer object on a particular page, making sure that one, all of these variables are here, all these different data points that should be there are there. That's number one. If something's not there, then it's obviously not going to be available to be used. Number two, making sure that our format is correct. Specifically, again, going back to what that native functionality is within a lot of different tags with Google Analytics and Enhanced E-commerce. If we have the data layer in this structure as it's laid out right here, it's just automatically going to grab all of that purchase, transaction, and product information. But in order for that to be true, it has to be in this format. So that's critical. One, making sure that it is in the format, and then two, making sure that yes, the variable's there, but also that the value is the value that we're expecting and in the structure that we're expecting. So an example I gave here, revenue, the issue is that it includes tax. In this context, it should exclude tax and shipping. It might be something like that revenue value is number dot number, and it should just be number dot number. A number of different issues that can arise when we're talking about what those values are. But step one, making sure yes, my variable is there. There is a home for that data point, and then number two, making sure that the data that we're going to be ingesting is in the proper format and includes what it should include. So now to actually go through and what manual testing looks like, how we're pulling it up, what we're looking at, and how we can drop down through those different items. So I'm actually going to hop onto a website, and I have no affiliation with this website. I actually just looked on Google's site for case studies, so I knew who was using GTM and GA, and I figured that if they're in a case study, they probably have a decent setup. So we're going to use the GoPro website here as an example. So what I will do when testing and validating a data layer, and this is true for both if I'm manually going through entire workflow or an entire implementation, or also just spot checking. I mean, I know many people on here probably aren't in the position to where they have to test a full-blown implementation, which great. But there are going to be instances where you're responsible for a particular tag, or you're working within a particular platform, and you want to know, hey, is this working? And if it's not, why? Is the data available? Is this interaction maybe tracked? Am I getting an event period being pushed to the data layer when a certain interaction happens? And that's where this manual process can really, really come in handy, understanding how we're going about it. So what I will do and what you can do is just pull up your browser's development tools just by right-clicking on a page, going to inspect and inspecting the page. That's going to be true regardless of the browser that you're using. I'm obviously using Chrome here. So walking through what the actual manual testing process looks like here, we can inspect, obviously, and then we're going to want to go to our console over here. Now within the console, what we're going to be looking for and what we're going to need to know the name of is what our global JavaScript object on that page, what the actual data layer variable is called. Now, if the site that you're working with, or if you're using Google Tag Manager, by default, it's going to be data layer. That's why I chose this website with the GA example, because I knew exactly what it would be called. If you're using Telium, a lot of times it'll be like utag dot something. Yeah, a lot of customization when it comes to if you're using like Adobe's DTM. It could be a number of different things. Really, with any tag management system, it can be whatever named whatever you want, but in many cases, it'll just be simply data layer. Now, to access what is contained within the data layer, we can open up and use that drop down there for that object, and then start breaking out the different objects that are contained within the overall data layer object. Now, each time, we went through this briefly on the data layer deep dive, but each time a data layer.push happens, and that might be, well, let me take a step back. So when you first load a web page, your data layer, that object, that variable is going to be defined. Oftentimes, it's going to be defined with the page and user information on that particular page. So it might be your page type, page category, page name, page URL, all that sort of information. So they'll define the data layer containing those variables and those values. And then as interactions happen, so as I scroll through a website or click on buttons, at that point, your development team is going to implement push calls. So it'll be like data layer.push, and then it'll be containing whatever that contextual information happens. So it's adding to that object that's already sitting there. So when we talk about the data layer kind of as a container that then contains all the different data points that you'll be using for the tags, think about when those pushes happen, additional tools and additional data points are being added to that container that's sitting there, so that they're then able to be used by other things, other platforms. So whenever those pushes happen, it's going to create a new object here within your overall data layer object. And so we need to drop those down to see, okay, what is the event? And then with that event, what other contextual information is included with that at that time? That's all going to be included with that push. So as I'm going through and testing, and this is obviously an e-commerce site, so a great example is going to be to go to a product page. So here, say I'm testing this website. I want to make sure that when I'm on a category page here, cameras, that I have information around all the different products that I'm viewing. So impression information, as well as page information, user information. So I'm going to come here into the console. I'm going to enter in just data layer, enter. And then I'm going to drop down all those different objects that are contained within my global JavaScript object, which is the data layer. I can then start dropping these down. So I can see within the first one, this is what's going to be there and what's going to be defined when the data layer is initially being defined. I can see country, null, doesn't have my location. Currency code, US dollars, the event, data layer loaded, so that it was initialized. List name, so it does have the category. And then the page category, this has more of a page type, is what I would probably tell them. But that is a product list, and then the list name is for cameras. So I can then start dropping these down and seeing, okay, what are the other pushes that happen? What other information's here? One, GTM.js. One handy thing about Google Tag Manager, it's going to automatically push timing events to the data layer. So when GTM.js is the page load timing event on the website, it'll push GTM.js at that point. If you're using like just the built-in triggers or firing rules within that platform, and you see page view, that corresponds to GTM.js. Other objects in here, so I have my e-commerce, so I do have impression information. One thing I would be testing is to make sure that, okay, this is the product I can see, Hero 5 Black, making sure that that first impression is for the Hero 5 Black product, make sure my ID is correct, make sure my price is correct, as well as the variant, just for, looks like a SKU. So those are the sorts of things that you're going to want to be testing, and that's how exactly you would access it here. Again, we can use that a testing document like I had outlined, where I would have, okay, for this particular type of page, these are the data points that should be there. This is the structure and then these are the values. I can do regression tests for a specific product where I already know, what this ID is, make sure all those different items match as they're supposed to. So if you have that full testing documentation for the full tag implementation, I can put that together for start to end, homepage, category pages, list pages, product pages, checkout, confirmation on an e-commerce site, or on my on a content site. I can just make sure, okay, on every single article page, blog page, video, these are the different contextual information and data points that are available, and yes, that they are there across every single page. Now, the other thing for testing would be obviously events. So making sure that when interactions happen, those events are pushed to the data layer, then the proper context information is also included. So one might be an add to cart. So I can actually do that action. I can add this to the cart, and then I'm going to want to re-look at the data layer. Now, a thing to mention here is as the order in which these different objects are here, timing matters. So it is the order in which the different data points and different objects are being pushed to my data layer object. So if I'm looking for an event or an interaction that I just did, I'm going to look here down towards the bottom. The very last thing here is an add to cart event. I've got my product SKU. I've got the quantity. Other things I might want added in here would be like the product price, variant, different contextual information for that product, namely price, because then I can do use some variables in order to be able to calculate things like total basket price, which is going to be necessary for some platforms that you might be working with. So that's how to test. So we went through what the documentation looks like, what we need included, what we need written out, and then how we can organize it, and then how we can actually go through and test and compare what the documentation has to what is actually on the website. So that's what the manual process looks like. The next thing I want to get into is just some considerations to think about, as one, as you're architecting this, and then two, to really hone in on as you're testing. And we actually, it looks like, have a question which kind of plays directly into this. The question is, how important is it to have consistent keys instead of dynamic keys? And in terms of keys, I'm assuming you're referring to the actual variable name and variable value that's going to be pushed into the data layer. So as an example here on this website would be something like e-commerce add products 0. So the key here, as I would define it, would be like name, and making sure that your product name on any add to cart event is in this particular structure and has this this key name. That is critical. So when you're creating those macros, or you're creating those variables within your tag management system, what those are going to be doing is referencing a particular key. So it doesn't matter if you're able to use something like dot notation, as you are in many tag management systems, or just using some of the built-in functionality of the different tag management systems that are out there. Those are going to be referencing that key, so it's critical to have it match. It'd be the same across different pages and across different interactions. That's actually kind of twofold, and we'll get to it here with the with some of the considerations to think about as you're testing. But that can potentially cause some issues when it comes to a single page application website, just because your data layer is never going to refresh and it's going to persist. So you might have to take some additional steps with clearing those different values when you go from one quote unquote virtual page to another. But I'll touch on that here in a second. But just in general, you're going to want static values for these different keys, and then the only dynamic aspect is going to be the the values that are associated with these. So getting into some of those different important considerations to really think about. Number one, timing. And I have an exclamation point here because it is critical. Data must be available to be used. People sometimes will forget that. When we're looking at a data layer object, say I'm using that GTM.js, let's hop back here. Say I'm using this GTM.js event, or the natural page view event within my tag management system, in order to be able to collect information. The only information that's available right now for a tag to grab from the data layer is what's available within that object index is 0. If I want to have some sort of like a product information, that's not available to be used. So again, timing is critical. So just because something is there by the time that my entire page has loaded does not mean that it's there at the time in which my tag is executing. So in that documentation, thinking about what is triggering my tags, the things that I have on the website, and then making sure when you're testing that yes, that value is there, yes, that variable is there, yes, it's in the right format, but it's also available by the time that some of these different platforms are going to need it on my website. Second thing to really think about is naming conventions. That goes back to the question that was just asked. So how important it is to have consistent nomenclature when it comes to those key values. Huge. Again, and I had explained that, but the variables and the macros and things that you're using within the tag management system are referencing those keys. So it needs to be consistent so that it knows what to look for, and then it's going to grab the corresponding value. Next piece is variables and data layer structure. That's similar to the naming conventions, but the data layer structure is important just because, one, the native functionality available for different types of tags, different types of platforms, as well as how we're building out those different macros variables. The last piece here is the type of site and then any persistent variables or values. So a single page application, again, it makes things a little bit more complicated. I know a lot of development teams are really embracing single page applications just because for performance types of issues. But when it comes to data collection, a lot of tag management functionality and just tag functionality in general hasn't yet quite caught up. So it takes some customization and really thinking about what is the effect of this, how is the site behaving, and what do I need to do. One thing when talking about the data layer is that, again, it will persist from one quote unquote page change or page state change to another because there is no hard refresh of the page. So those values are going to persist and they're going to be available unless they're cleared out. I'm not going to get into it today exactly how that exactly works, but just something to think about and something to really look at as you're testing and going through. In the same vein, on a regular website, that hard refresh does happen when you're going from one page to another. So those variables and those values are going to be cleared out. So just because something is available on your category or your list page does not mean that it's also going to be available on your product page. So think about that as you're testing. Just because you see it once doesn't mean you're going to see it all the time. The next thing, and that's really going through testing on, in that manual process, if you're going through and spot checking, and really wanting to dig in deep and really understanding how exactly that works. Next thing I just want to touch on is some automated testing and then validations at scale. 3 ways, realistically, to be able to do this. One, not ideal, but tag data and reporting. So you're referencing that central data layer. You have all the different tags and the different platforms that are going to be referencing the same keys, key value pairs, the different variables, values. If you see an outage for a particular data attribute in one platform, it's going to be the same across all. It's not going to be there. So leveraging that central data layer in testing becomes a little bit simpler because any sort of an issue is not going to be unique to a particular platform and how something is configured. It's going to be unique to the data layer. So you can really see there if you have a lot of different pages, a large site, or a number of sites, and you have a consistent structure. Second means of being able to test is what I like to call a collection platform. So, or a collection engine. So what you can do here, it's a little bit of a hack, but you can send events or data to a collection point in order to be able to highlight errors. Now this could be an analytics platform. We'll do it sometimes with something like a free version of Google Analytics. One consideration when you're considering what that collection platform or engine is going to be is how much customization is it going to take, one, and two, what is pricing? How does that work? If you're using something like the free Google Analytics here, it can be useful because there are no hit limits. I mean, yes, you're sampling in sampling is going to factor in reporting, but we're not using this reporting for anything other than to just highlight errors. So what you would do in this particular context is create some custom JavaScript within your tag management system to return a true false value depending upon the status of a certain aspect. So you might have a particular variable pointed to a certain a page attribute. So is page type defined on all pages in my data layer object? I can then do custom JavaScript to see, is it defined? Yes, no. And then return the value of that. I'm going to know, okay, is page type defined across every single page? And if not, I'm going to have within pages type reporting or event reporting, I'm going to have what pages it's not defined on. So you can really test it at a massive scale and just make sure that everything is working across the entire site in this particular manner. One drawback of this is that you're going to need to be able to isolate potential issues to test them specifically. It's very difficult, well, possible, but it's going to take a lot of effort to create some of these events and different macros and variables and custom JavaScript within the tag management system for every single piece of tracking that you're doing within the data layer. So, but if we can identify some very high value targets that we're needing to test and also some likely culprits of other issues, we can point these sorts of events directly to them. And again, I just have there at the end recommend using something that you're not charged based upon a hit limit, such as free GA. It can be pretty useful if you're going about it this route. And then the last piece is using some sort of an automated tool. I'd be remiss if I didn't call out Tag Inspector as a means of doing it here. We're going to have a short training webinar next week titled leveraging Tag Inspector for data layer testing and validation and monitoring. So I'll go through more specifics here, but using a tool such as Tag Inspector where we can just go ahead and define what the required behavior is, what should be there, what should the structure look like. We can use regex to define what, again, the structure should look like, and we can just automatically test. The beauty of using a tool such as this is being able to, one, use it in the testing and validation stage at a massive, massive scale across hundreds, thousands of sites, thousands of web pages, but also being able to just leave it running and monitor these things moving forward. One of the first things we touched on was the importance of validating and monitoring and checking these things on an ongoing basis to make sure that your architecture is still solid moving forward. And this can help out quite a bit with that. I know we're running out of time here. Just to quickly summarize, today obviously we went through data layer structure, quick review. What does that look like? What's included? What needs to be included? Some of the pieces of documentation that, one, you should have as you're architecting and implementing the data layer, and then also how to translate those into testing documentation, how to access the data layer and actually test it manually, and some of the implications of different types of sites and how things are working within that data layer, and then also some different strategies for automating testing and then validation at a massive, massive scale. Just because I know that manual testing, when you're dealing with multiple websites and very large websites, isn't really a possibility outside of hitting the high notes, one of each type of page. But using some of those automated techniques can really help you at scale handle all these different things. At this point, I will turn it over to any additional questions that we have here. All right. One, are variables such as ecom value supported in GTM? Any variable, and this is asking about GTM specifically, any variable is going to be supported. It's just defining what that variable is so that whatever your tag management system is, whatever you're using in your tag management system knows what to look for. That's really the key. I mean, variables, everything can be easily customized and played with there. Let's see. Will variables be overwritten if they are pushed twice to the data layer with different values? Yes. Yes, they will. Well, I guess it depends on the platform that you're working with. So here you're using data layer with CamelCase, so I'm assuming referring to GTM. So with Google Tag Manager, a data layer variable, or how you have it defined within GTM, is going to be overwritten. So say I have page type X, and then I have another page type Y. Page type X is first pushed, and then page type Y. As soon as that page type Y is going to overwrite X. Now, in the context of your actual data layer object itself, it really depends how it's being referenced. So if it's a top level, use the actual example. So just because a variable name is the same as somewhere else doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be treated the exact same way. It's all about how the configuration happens within the tag management system and how that variable name is being referenced. For example, here we have so say within impressions 0, say like underneath this category value right here, I had another variable that was called something that's up here, page category. So say page category was here, and it's called product list. And then down here, e-commerce, add products 0, page category was page name, something else. So how you're going to configure that macro or that variable within your tag management system is it's going to reference something unique, such as like page category here. And then if I have a different variable referencing it in a different manner here, those two values are going to be different. So I know that might be a little bit confusing, but in the data layer, no, they are unique, but how they're being referenced by the tools, by the tags that you're working with, is going to result in, if variable names are shared, it's going to result in the values to be overwritten. I have a question about just sharing sample documentation case study. Absolutely, we'll include that. The end of all these webinars, we always send out a summary and thank you email, and we can include some of that documentation in there. And that looks like everything in here now. As always, if there are additional questions that you have for me, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can reach me via the Tag Inspector website, or just reach out to me directly. I'm happy to help out in any way. Any additional questions, happy to answer them. Thank you all again for your time in going through this today. And then don't forget to go ahead and register and join us next week as we go through specifically leveraging Tag Inspector in order to be able to test and validate the data layer and hopefully, at a large scale, and then even just simplifying the process. That can be really useful. So thank you all. Have a great rest of the week, and hope to see you back here again next week.